Mr. Ullman, I'm glad you brought up a point. It's been mentioned a couple of times already at the early start of this hearing about rural and remote. And I have to tell this story. When I graduated from college with a degree in agriculture, I went back to rural Monroe County, Kentucky, and worked on a farm, my farm, for 5 years, full-time. Farm to this day, but full-time. I was in a tractor, sometimes 10, 12, 14 hours a day. And I listened to the radio, and the only radio station I could get that had news was public radio. So I listened to as many hours of public radio as anyone on this panel, I can assure you. And it was a great service. That was 30-some years ago. Today, in that same remote area, I mean, you've got Sirius XM, you've got podcasts, there's internet access now, there's a whole menu of media options now. So, but over time, and I still occasionally listen to NPR because I just want to hear what they have to say, and I don't even recognize the station anymore. It's not news. I feel like it's propaganda. I feel like there's disinformation every time I listen to NPR. And, you know, a media entity like MSNBC or Huffington Post that, in my opinion, consistently spews disinformation, they can do that. They're a private company. But NPR gets federal funds. And you know, I have a problem with that. Because if people in Alaska, if all they have is public radio, then all they know is what these headlines say. And they're wrong about COVID-19. And the headlines are in the background. I don't have time to go over all these headlines that are wrong. About Russian collusion, wrong, wrong. About the Hunter Biden laptop, wrong. And then there's a story about me. And part of what we went through on this committee during the Biden investigation, which, by the way, ended with Joe Biden's last act as President of the United States, pardoned his entire family preemptively for an 11-year period, which just so happened to be the 11-year period that this committee investigated the Bidens, that we had subpoenaed bank records. I don't think NPR reported about the pardons, but they reported a lot about how there was no evidence of any wrongdoing and things that just weren't true. In fact, there's a story, NPR, lawmaker leading Hunter Biden House investigation accused of owning a shell company. Well, that's me. Ms. Maher, are you familiar with that story that NPR wrote about me at the height of the Biden investigation when you all were disputing every aspect of our investigation that is 100% factual? We have hundreds of pages of evidence, hundreds of pages of bank records, hundreds of pages of emails. Do you remember the story that NPR wrote about me saying I had a shell company?
Congressman, I was not at NPR at the time, and I'm unfamiliar with the story.
Where do you get your sources on something like that? That's a very serious accusation because we're investigating a president and his family who had 28 shell companies. I have an LLC, had 5 properties in it. It's in my financial disclosure form. I've gone into great detail, given lots of interviews. But people that listen to NPR, they're totally disinformed on the truth. And you know, I have a problem with that because you get federal funds. And I do believe there was a role for public radio 30 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, maybe 5 years ago. But because of technology today, I don't think there's a role for public radio anymore. And I think you've abused the privilege that you had with receiving federal funds. Because these headlines here are not true. This is disinformation on some huge topics. Do you want to dispute anything that I said in the remaining 30 seconds?
Thank you, Congressman. First of all, I want to recognize your concerns. One of the first things that I did in coming in May was to beef up our editorial standards. I directed my editor-in-chief, who, by the way,
why is NPR even doing editorials?
I'm so sorry.
Even do editorials?
I don't mean editorial in terms of opinion editorial.
Do you even need opinion? What does it matter with the opinion? If you're a federally funded entity that's supposed to provide the news, Can you not provide the news?
Of course.
Fair and balanced?
Of course, Congressman. I mean, editorial standards for our journalism was to beef up our editorial practices, bringing in more editors to make sure that we have more points of view reflected in every story. I've engaged in a number of actions trying to address
and my
some of
time's
these
expired.
concerns.
I've lost confidence in public radio. I don't think, Madam Chair, they should get a penny of federal funds. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I now recognize Mr. Garcia from California for 5 minutes.